Karla Homolka. She was a blonde veterinary assistant with a warm smile and an easy laugh. The neighbors in St. Catharines, Ontario, thought she had found her perfect match. But Karla Homolka would become one of the most reviled figures in Canadian criminal history, and the full scope of her participation in unspeakable acts would not emerge until it was far too late to undo a deal that still haunts prosecutors to this day. Karla Leanne Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario. She grew up in a middle-class household, the eldest of 3 daughters. By all outward appearances, she was a typical suburban teenager. She excelled in school, held part-time jobs, and dreamed of working with animals. At 17, she met Paul Bernardo at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. He was charming, well-dressed, and seemed destined for success. Within weeks, they were inseparable. What Karla did not know, or perhaps chose not to see, was that Paul Bernardo was already under investigation. Between 1987 and 1990, a series of violent assaults had terrorized the Scarborough area. Investigators had compiled a suspect list, and Bernardo's name appeared on it. But DNA testing was still in its early stages, and the connection would not be confirmed for years. In December 1990, Karla made a decision that defies comprehension. As a Christmas gift to Paul, she helped him drug and assault her own younger sister, Tammy. The sedatives used were veterinary anesthetics that Karla had stolen from her workplace. Tammy Homolka, just 15 years old, never regained consciousness. She passed away that night. The official cause was listed as accidental, attributed to choking. No one suspected foul play. Over the next 2 years, at least 2 more young women would be abducted from the streets of Burlington and St. Catharines. Leslie Mahaffey, 14, disappeared in June 1991. Her remains were found encased in concrete blocks in Lake Gibson. Kristen French, 15, was taken in April 1992. Her body was discovered in a ditch 2 weeks later. Throughout this period, Karla maintained her image as Paul's devoted fiancée. They married in a lavish ceremony in June 1991, just weeks after Leslie Mahaffey was taken. The unraveling began in January 1993, when Karla appeared at a hospital with severe facial injuries. Paul had beaten her with a flashlight. She left him, and within weeks, retained a lawyer. What followed would become one of the most controversial plea agreements in Canadian legal history. How does a prosecutor weigh justice for the deceased against the need to secure a conviction? Karla's attorneys approached the Crown with an offer. She would provide testimony against Paul Bernardo, detailing his role as the primary perpetrator in exchange for a reduced sentence. At the time, investigators had circumstantial evidence but lacked the definitive proof needed for conviction. Karla's account positioned her as a coerced victim, a battered woman who participated under duress. The Crown accepted. In May 1993, Karla Homolka pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. She received 2 concurrent 12-year sentences. Then the videotapes surfaced. Paul Bernardo's defense team discovered recordings that showed Karla as an active, willing participant in the assaults. The footage contradicted her claims of coercion entirely, but the plea deal had already been signed. The Crown could not revoke it. Paul Bernardo was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment with dangerous offender status. Karla served her 12 years. The public outcry was immediate and sustained. Victim advocacy groups condemned the agreement. The families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French expressed devastation. The case prompted a formal review of plea bargaining practices in Ontario. Some legal scholars argued that the deal was necessary given the evidence available at the time. Others maintained that Carla's manipulation of the system represented a fundamental failure of justice. Carla Homolka was released from prison on July 4, 2005. She changed her name to Leanne Teal and later moved to the Caribbean before settling in Quebec. In 2012, reports emerged that she was living in Chateau Gay, married with 3 children. She volunteered at her children's school until her identity was discovered and she was asked to leave. As of 2024, Carla Homolka remains a free woman. She has never expressed public remorse. Paul Bernardo remains incarcerated at Millhaven Institution. His parole has been denied multiple times, most recently in 2021. The plea agreement that set her free was negotiated based on testimony that videotape evidence would later contradict. The woman who stood beside a predator, who provided the means and opportunity for young women to be harmed, served less than a decade for each life lost. Not every perpetrator arrives wearing a mask. Jodi Arias. She was the ex-girlfriend who could not let go. He was the motivational speaker with a 1,000-watt smile. When Travis Alexander was found deceased in his Mesa, Arizona home in June 2008, Jodi Arias had 3 different stories for investigators. None of them were true. Jodi Ann Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California. She grew up in a household marked by instability, later claiming physical discipline from both parents. She dropped out of high school and worked a series of service industry jobs throughout her 20s. In September 2006, at a conference for prepaid legal services in Las Vegas, she met Travis Alexander. Travis was 5 years older than Jodi, a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and an up-and-coming figure in the company's sales network. Friends described him as charismatic and ambitious. Within weeks of meeting, Jodi and Travis began a relationship. She converted to Mormonism and was baptized in November 2006. By early 2007, she had moved to Mesa to be closer to him. The relationship was volatile from the start. Travis's friends later testified that he expressed concerns about Jodi's intensity. She reportedly followed him, checked his phone, and appeared at his home unannounced. They officially broke up in June 2007, but continued an intimate relationship for months afterward. In April 2008, Jodi moved back to California. Travis began dating other women. He had planned a trip to Cancun with a new romantic interest for June. On June 4, 2008, Jodi Arias drove from her home in Eureka, California, to Mesa, Arizona. The drive covered over 1,000 miles and crossed multiple state lines. She later claimed she had rented a car, turned off her cell phone, and brought a firearm that she said was for protection. She arrived at Travis Alexander's home in the early morning hours of June 5th. What happened inside that house would be reconstructed through photographs recovered from a camera found in Travis's washing machine. The timestamps told a story. At approximately 5:30 in the afternoon on June 4th, intimate photographs were taken. By 5:32, the images turned to chaos. A photograph captured Travis sitting in his shower. 44 seconds later, an image showed the ceiling above the bathroom, blurred as if the camera had been dropped. The final photograph showed what investigators believed was Travis's body on the bathroom floor. Travis Alexander sustained 27 stab wounds, a 4-inch deep slash across his throat, and a gunshot wound to the head. He was 30 years old. His body was discovered 5 days later by friends who had grown concerned when he missed multiple appointments. The shower was still running. Jodi Arias was identified as a person of interest almost immediately. What does it reveal when someone crafts multiple narratives rather than one? In her first interview with Mesa police detective Esteban Flores, Jody denied any involvement. She had not been in Arizona, she claimed. She was nowhere near Travis's home. When confronted with evidence that her palm print had been found at the scene in a mixture of her blood and Travis's, her story changed. She then claimed that two masked intruders had broken in and attacked them both. She barely escaped with her life, she said. The investigation continued. In July 2008, Jodi Arias was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. It was only after her arrest that she offered a third version of events. She admitted to taking Travis's life but claimed it was self-defense. He had attacked her, she said, after she dropped his camera in the bathroom. She feared for her life. The trial of Jodi Arias began in January 2013 and lasted nearly 5 months. It became a media sensation, broadcast in its entirety on cable news networks. The prosecution, led by Juan Martinez, argued that the attack was premeditated. He pointed to the rental car, the turned-off phone, the gas cans she purchased to avoid leaving a fuel trail across state lines. The defense argued that Travis had been emotionally and physically abusive, that Jodi suffered from post-traumatic stress, and that her actions were those of a woman in survival mode. The jury did not agree with the defense. On May 8, 2013, Jodi Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase, however, ended in a hung jury. A second sentencing jury also deadlocked in March 2015. Unable to reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty, the judge was left to impose the sentence herself. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her statement to the court, Jodi expressed regret, but stopped short of a full admission of responsibility. The Alexander family delivered victim impact statements that were broadcast nationwide. As of 2024, Jodi Arias remains incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. She has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. Travis Alexander's family has continued to advocate for victims of violent crime, establishing a foundation in his memory. She told 3 different stories. The evidence told a fourth. Susan Smith. A young mother stood before television cameras in Union, South Carolina, tears streaming down her face. She begged for the safe return of her 2 sons, taken, she said, by an armed carjacker. 9 days later, the nation would learn that the only danger those boys had faced came from the woman pleading for their lives. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina. Her childhood was marked by tragedy. When she was 6 years old, her father took his own life. Her mother remarried, but Susan later alleged that her stepfather had been inappropriate with her beginning when she was a teenager. These claims were never prosecuted, though her stepfather would later acknowledge an inappropriate relationship when Susan was an adult. By her early 20s, Susan had married David Smith and given birth to 2 sons. Michael Daniel Smith was born in October 1991. Alexander Tyler Smith followed in August 1993. The marriage was troubled from the start. Both Susan and David had engaged in extramarital relationships. They separated in September 1994. In the weeks before October 19th, Susan had begun a relationship with Tom Findlay, the son of the owner of the textile company where she worked. Findlay was wealthy, handsome, and popular in Union's social circles. On October 17th, he wrote Susan a letter ending their relationship. Among his reasons, he cited her children. He was not ready, he wrote, to take on the responsibility of being a father. 2 days later, on October 19, 1994, Susan Smith drove to John D. Long Lake with Michael, 3 years old, and Alex, 14 months old, strapped into their car seats. She stepped out of the vehicle, released the parking brake, and watched as the car rolled down the boat ramp and into the water. Her sons were still inside. For 9 days, Susan Smith appeared on national television. She held press conferences. She made direct appeals to the alleged kidnapper. She described the carjacker as a black man who had forced her from the vehicle at a stoplight. The description prompted a massive search. Authorities set up roadblocks. The FBI joined the investigation. The community rallied around a grieving mother. Why do some lies unravel under scrutiny while others persist? The investigation began to close in almost immediately. The intersection where Susan claimed the carjacking occurred had a traffic light. On the night in question, that light had been set to blinking red, meaning there would have been no reason for her to stop there. The timeline she provided did not match the physical evidence. Investigators noted inconsistencies in her emotional responses during interviews. On November 3, 1994, during an interrogation with Union County Sheriff Howard Wells, Susan Smith confessed. She led investigators to John D. Long Lake. Divers recovered the vehicle and the bodies of Michael and Alexander Smith. The boys were still in their car seats. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Her trial began in July 1995. The prosecution sought the death penalty. Solicitor Tommy Pope argued that Susan had made a calculated decision to end her children's lives because they were an obstacle to the relationship she wanted. The defense presented evidence of her troubled childhood, her mental health struggles, and her history of suicidal ideation. A psychiatrist testified that Susan suffered from dependent personality disorder. The jury found Susan Smith guilty on both counts. During the sentencing phase, they considered the aggravating and mitigating factors. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, they returned with their recommendation. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The verdict drew mixed reactions. Some felt that the death penalty was appropriate given the nature of the crime. Others believed the evidence of mental illness warranted mercy. The families struggled with a grief that had no easy resolution. David Smith, the boy's father, has spoken publicly about his ongoing trauma. Susan Smith has been incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina since her conviction. During her imprisonment, she has been cited for multiple disciplinary infractions, including inappropriate relationships with prison guards. 2 correctional officers were terminated and prosecuted for engaging in sexual contact with her. Her first parole eligibility date was November 4, 2024. The South Carolina Department of Corrections confirmed that she was eligible to apply. As of early 2025, her parole application remains under review. For 9 days, she stood before cameras as a mother in mourning. The lake was less than a mile from her home. Those boys trusted the only person in the world who should have protected them, Stacy Castor. She was a devoted wife who buried 2 husbands. She was a loving mother who nearly lost her daughter. But when toxicology reports and a suicide note did not add up, investigators in upstate New York began to suspect that the woman weeping at the funerals might have been the one filling the caskets. Stacy Ruth Daniels was born on July 24, 1967, in Syracuse, New York. She grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of Onondaga County. In 1985, at 18 years old, she married Michael Wallace. The couple had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree. By all outward appearances, they were a typical suburban family. In January 2000, Michael Wallace passed away. He was 38 years old. The cause listed on his death certificate was a heart attack, attributed to an apparent coronary event. An autopsy was not performed. Stacy collected his life insurance policy and moved on. Less than 3 years later, in 2003, Stacy married David Castor, a successful heating and air conditioning business owner. They settled into a comfortable home in Liverpool, New York. David's family would later describe initial concerns about how quickly the relationship moved, but David seemed happy. The marriage proceeded without visible incident until August 2005. On August 22, 2005, Stacy called emergency services. She reported that David had locked himself in the bedroom and would not respond. When paramedics arrived, they found David Castor deceased. He was 48 years old. A glass of green liquid sat on the nightstand, later identified as containing antifreeze. The medical examiner ruled the death suspicious, but the investigation stalled. Stacy maintained that David had been depressed and had taken his own life. She collected his estate, valued at approximately $180,000. Life insurance added another $50,000. She began making plans for the future. The Onondaga County Sheriff's Office did not close the case. Detective Dominic Spinelli continued to investigate, driven by inconsistencies that did not sit right. The container of antifreeze found in the home had only Stacy's fingerprints on it, not David's. If David had poured himself that drink, why were his prints absent from the bottle? The detective went further. He requested that Michael Wallace's body be exhumed and tested. The results came back in 2007. Michael Wallace's tissues contained lethal levels of ethylene glycol, the primary component of antifreeze. His death, originally attributed to natural causes, was reclassified as a homicide. Investigators now had 2 deceased husbands and a single common factor. What does it take to look past grief and into something darker? On September 14, 2007, Ashley Wallace, Stacy's eldest daughter, was found unresponsive in her bedroom. Beside her was a glass of juice and a typed suicide note. The note was extraordinary in its specificity. Ashley appeared to confess to both her stepfather's death and her father's death. She expressed remorse and stated that she could no longer live with what she had done. But Ashley Wallace did not pass away. Paramedics revived her. When she regained consciousness, she told investigators that her mother had made her a drink the night before. She remembered feeling tired, taking a few sips, and nothing else. Toxicology showed that Ashley had consumed a lethal amount of crushed sedatives and vodka. The suicide note was analyzed. Digital forensics revealed that it had been created on Stacy's computer. The user history showed that it had been typed on the night Ashley nearly died, while Stacy was the only one awake in the house. Investigators also discovered that the note contained a term Stacy commonly used, but Ashley never did. Stacy Castor was arrested on September 14, 2007, and charged with second-degree murder in David Castor's death, the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and forgery. She was subsequently charged with the murder of Michael Wallace as well. Her trial began in January 2009. Prosecutor Christine Garvey presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, computer records, and timeline reconstruction. Stacy's defense attorney argued that Ashley was responsible for David's death and had tried to frame her mother before attempting to take her own life. The jury did not find this compelling. On February 5, 2009, Stacey Castor was found guilty of second-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, and 3 counts of forgery. She was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison, with sentences running consecutively. Stacey Castor was incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. She maintained her innocence throughout her imprisonment. On June 11, 2016, she passed away at the facility. She was 48 years old. The cause was listed as a heart attack, though some reports noted she had been in declining health. Ashley Wallace has spoken publicly about her experience. In interviews, she described the process of accepting that her own mother had tried to take her life and had likely been responsible for her father's death. She testified against Stacey at trial. She has since become an advocate for victims of domestic violence and family abuse. 2 husbands, 1 daughter in a hospital bed, the same substance in different glasses. The woman who typed a confession was not the woman whose name appeared at the bottom. Darlie Routier. 2 young boys were attacked fatally in the family room of their suburban Dallas home. Their mother stood in the same room with wounds of her own, pointing toward an intruder who left through a slashed window screen. But when blood spatter analysis and a birthday party video entered the courtroom, the prosecution argued the intruder had never existed. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Her family moved to Lubbock, Texas when she was a child, and later settled in the Dallas suburb of Rowlett. She was described as outgoing, social, and image-conscious. In 1988, at 18 years old, she married Darren Routier. He had started a small electronics testing company, and the family lived comfortably in a 2-story home on Eagle Drive. By 1996, Darlie and Darren had 3 sons. Devin was 6 years old. Damon was 5. The baby, Drake, was 7 months old. On the night of June 5, 1996, Darlie had fallen asleep on the couch in the downstairs family room. Devin and Damon were sleeping nearby on the floor. Darren and Drake were upstairs. At approximately 2:31 in the morning on June 6th, Darlie called 911. She was hysterical, screaming that someone had broken in and attacked her children. When paramedics arrived, they found Devin and Damon with multiple stab wounds. Both boys would succumb to their injuries. Devin had been struck multiple times in the chest. Damon had wounds to his back. Darlie had a slash across her throat that came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery, as well as defensive wounds on her arms. Darlie's account was as follows. She woke to Damon pressing on her shoulder, saying he had been hurt. She saw a figure moving through the kitchen toward the garage. She gave chase, then realized she was bleeding herself. She returned to the family room and called for help. She described the intruder as a man wearing dark clothing. Police searched the house and surrounding area. They found a window screen in the garage that had been slashed. A bread knife from the Routier kitchen was discovered in a flower bed. There was no sign of forced entry at any door or window. Nothing of value appeared to have been taken. The family dog had not barked. What separates grief from performance in the eyes of those watching? 8 days after the attack, on what would have been Devin's 7th birthday, the family held a memorial at the boy's gravesite. Television cameras captured the event. Darlie was filmed laughing, spraying silly string on the headstones, and appearing to celebrate. The footage would become a focal point of the prosecution's case. Darlie Routier was arrested on June 18, 1996, and charged with capital murder. The prosecution argued that she had staged the entire attack. They pointed to the blood evidence in the family room, which they said showed the assault had happened. while the victims were stationary, not during a struggle. They noted that Darlie's wounds, while significant, were not life-threatening and appeared to be self-inflicted. The window screen, they argued, had been cut from inside the house, not outside. The defense countered that Darlie had no motive. She had been a devoted mother. She had no history of violence. Her injuries were real and severe. They presented evidence of an unknown bloody fingerprint found on a coffee table that did not match anyone in the Routier household. They argued that the investigation had suffered from tunnel vision, that police had focused on Darlie to the exclusion of other possibilities. The trial began in January 1997. It lasted less than a month. On February 1st, the jury found Darlie Routier guilty of capital murder in the death of Damon Routier. She was not separately tried for Devon's death. On February 4th, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Darlie Routier was transferred to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, home to the state's female death row. She has maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest. Her case has attracted significant attention from advocacy groups and investigative journalists who have raised questions about the forensic evidence, the conduct of the trial, and the adequacy of her original defense. In 2008, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a request for new DNA testing on several items of evidence, including the bloody sock found in an alley 75 feet from the house, far from the path Darlie described taking. Testing has been conducted and reviewed multiple times. As of 2024, the results have not exonerated her. Darlie Routier remains on death row at the Mountain View unit. Her execution date has been postponed multiple times pending appeals. She is one of 6 women currently facing execution in Texas. Her appeals continue to work their way through the court system. 2 boys went to sleep in their own family room. By morning, they were gone. Their mother was the only witness to what happened that night. Whether she was victim or perpetrator remains for some an open question. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Betty Broderick. She had put him through medical school and law school. She had raised his children and hosted his parties. And when he left her for a younger woman, she told everyone who would listen that she would make him pay. On November 5th, 1989, she did. Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia was born on November 7th, 1947, in Eastchester, New York. She was raised in a strict Catholic household, the third of 6 children. She attended a Catholic school and later enrolled at the College of Mount St. Vincent. She was attractive, outgoing, and had been raised to believe that a woman's role was to support her husband's success. In 1965, she met Daniel Broderick at a college football game. Dan was attending Notre Dame, handsome and ambitious. They married in 1969. Over the next decade, Betty worked as a teacher and took on additional jobs to support the family, while Dan completed medical school and then law school at Harvard. When he passed the bar, she believed their sacrifice had paid off. Dan Broderick became one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego. The family moved into a custom-built home in the affluent neighborhood of La Jolla. They had 4 children. Betty devoted herself to being the perfect wife for a man on the rise. She organized charity events, decorated their home, and presented the image of an ideal family. Dan's income eventually exceeded $1 million annually. In 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant named Linda Kolkina. Linda was 21 years old, blonde, and by several accounts, captivating. Betty would later claim that she knew immediately something was wrong. Dan denied any affair for years, but Betty's suspicions grew. She found a receipt for a purchase at a women's clothing store. she intercepted a card Linda had written to Dan. In 1985, Dan moved out of the family home. The divorce proceedings that followed would last 4 years and become one of the most acrimonious legal battles in San Diego history. Dan controlled the finances and used his connections in the legal community to his advantage. Betty responded with escalating acts of retaliation. She drove her car through the front door of his new home. She left obscene messages on his answering machine. She was held in contempt of court multiple times. Does prolonged conflict eventually break something that cannot be repaired? In April 1989, Dan Broderick married Linda Kolkina. The divorce was finalized later that year. Betty received a settlement that included $16,000 per month in alimony. But she was not satisfied. She felt humiliated. She felt erased from the life she had built. On November 5, 1989, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, Betty Broderick used a key she had taken from one of her children to enter Dan and Linda's home in Marston Hills. She walked into the master bedroom carrying a .38 caliber revolver. She fired 5 shots. Dan Broderick, age 44, sustained wounds to his chest and back. Linda Broderick, age 28, was struck in the head and chest. Both were pronounced deceased at the scene. Betty fled the house and, within hours, turned herself in to the authorities. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Her first trial began in October 1990. The prosecution presented evidence of premeditation, including the key, the early morning timing, and Betty's years of documented hostility. The defense argued that Betty was a battered woman who had been emotionally and financially abused throughout her marriage and the divorce. They portrayed Dan as a controlling narcissist who had destroyed her sense of self. The jury deadlocked, with 2 jurors holding out for manslaughter. A second trial commenced in October 1991. This time, the prosecution focused more heavily on the specific events of that morning and less on the history of the marriage. Betty testified in her own defense, describing years of gaslighting and manipulation. She maintained that she had not intended to take their lives, that she only wanted to confront them. On December 11, 1991, the jury found Betty Broderick guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Betty Broderick has been denied parole multiple times, most recently in 2017. The parole board cited her lack of remorse and her continued insistence that she was the true victim. Her next parole hearing was scheduled for 2024. As of 2024, Betty Broderick remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She is in her mid-70s. She has given interviews from prison, maintaining that she was driven to an act she never planned by a man who left her no other recourse. Her case has been the subject of multiple books, television films, and a limited series. She spent 2 decades helping him build a life. She spent the next 4 years watching him build a new one without her. What transforms a scorned spouse into something else entirely is not a question the legal system was designed to answer. Pamela Smart. She was a 22-year-old media coordinator for the local school district. He was a 15-year-old student in her Project Self-Esteem class. When her husband was found deceased in their condominium in Derry, New Hampshire, investigators uncovered an affair, a manipulation, and a conspiracy that would make her one of the first defendants tried in the era of televised justice. Pamela Ann Wojas was born on August 16, 1967, in Coral Gables, Florida. Her family later moved to New Hampshire, where she graduated from Pinkerton Academy. She attended Florida State University, where she studied media communications. In 1989, she married Gregory Smart, her high school boyfriend. They settled into a condominium in Derry. Greg worked as an insurance salesman. Pamela took a position at Winnacunnet High School as a media services coordinator. In the fall of 1989, Pamela met William Flynn, a 15-year-old sophomore, through a drug awareness program she was helping to run. According to testimony that would later emerge at trial, their relationship quickly became inappropriate. Pamela allegedly told Flynn that she was unhappy in her marriage, that her husband was having an affair, and that she wished he were gone. On May 1, 1990, Gregory Smart, age 24, was found deceased in the couple's condominium. He had been shot once in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. The scene was staged to look like a burglary. Pamela appeared distraught. She held press conferences appealing for information about whoever had taken her husband's life. The investigation turned in June 1990 when Cecilia Pierce, a 16-year-old intern who worked with Pamela, went to police. Pierce had been told details of the plot by her friend, a young woman named Vance Latham Jr., who was connected to one of the participants. Police arranged for Pierce to wear a wire. Over several conversations, Pamela made statements that investigators believed implicated her in the planning of her husband's death. What does consent mean when one party holds authority over another? The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of William Flynn and two accomplices, Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr. All three teenagers agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Flynn testified that Pamela had seduced him, manipulated him emotionally, and told him that she could not be with him as long as her husband was alive. He testified that she had provided the access and the encouragement, and that he had pulled the trigger. Pamela Smart's trial began in March 1991. It was one of the first criminal trials to be broadcast live on television, from gavel to gavel. The media coverage was intense. Pamela was portrayed as a cold manipulator who had used her position of authority to turn a teenager into an instrument of violence. The defense argued that Flynn and his friends had committed the act on their own and were now blaming Pamela to save themselves. On March 22, 1991, the jury returned its verdict. Pamela Smart was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, being an accomplice to first-degree murder and witness tampering. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. William Flynn was sentenced to 28 years to life. He was paroled in 2015 after serving approximately 25 years. Patrick Randall, who drove the getaway car, received a sentence of 28 years to life and was paroled in 2016. Vance Latham Jr. received 18 years to life and was released in 2005. Pamela Smart has filed multiple petitions for sentence reduction. All have been denied. In 2020, her attorney submitted a request for commutation to the New Hampshire Executive Council, citing her age, her rehabilitation, and the disparity between her sentence and those of the actual perpetrators. The petition was denied. As of 2024, Pamela Smart remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She is the only person involved in Gregory Smart's death who has not been released. She maintains that she did not plan or encourage his death. The teenagers who pulled the trigger and held down the victim have walked free. The woman who allegedly told them what to do has not. Whether that represents justice or something else remains a matter of debate. Some cases are defined not by who acted, but by who persuaded. Janine Jones' children in her care stopped breathing. Infants went into cardiac arrest with no warning, and each time she was there to attempt the rescue, earning praise for her quick response. It took years before investigators understood that the emergencies were not accidents. They were auditions. Janine Ann Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas. She was adopted as an infant and raised in a middle-class family. Her childhood was reportedly unremarkable. After high school, she enrolled in beauty school but did not finish. She married and divorced twice. In 1977, she completed her training as a licensed vocational nurse. Her first position was at the Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, working in the pediatric intensive care unit. It was demanding work, caring for the most vulnerable patients. Janine appeared devoted. She stayed late. She volunteered for extra shifts. She was emotionally invested in her young patients, sometimes to a degree that concerned her colleagues. Then children began to die. Between 1980 and 1982, the pediatric ICU at Bexar County experienced a statistically improbable number of cardiac arrests and deaths. Many occurred during a specific shift. Many occurred when a specific nurse was assigned to the patient. Hospital administrators launched an internal review but found no conclusive evidence of wrongdoing. Rather than pursue a public investigation that might damage the hospital's reputation, they allowed Janine Jones to resign. In 1982, she was hired by Dr. Kathleen Holland, a pediatrician opening a new clinic in Kerrville, Texas. Within weeks of the clinic's opening, children began experiencing unexplained emergencies. Infants who had arrived for routine checkups would suddenly stop breathing. Each time, Janine was present. Each time, she initiated resuscitation. Some children survived, some did not. How long can patterns hide in plain sight when no one wants to see them? On September 17, 1982, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan was brought to Dr. Holland's clinic for a routine examination. During the visit, she experienced a sudden seizure. Janine Jones administered an injection, which she said was to help the child. Chelsea stopped breathing. She was transported to a hospital in San Antonio, but was pronounced deceased upon arrival. The cause of death was eventually determined to be an overdose of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant. A Kerr County grand jury began investigating. They discovered that Dr. Holland's clinic had been ordering far more succinylcholine than could be explained by legitimate use. They found vials with puncture marks that suggested unauthorized access. They found records of multiple children who had experienced emergencies only when Janine Jones was their attending nurse. In May 1984, Janine Jones stood trial for the death of Chelsea McClellan. The Sectina prosecution presented evidence that she had injected the child with succinylcholine, causing fatal respiratory arrest. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence linking Janine to the injection and that other factors could have caused Chelsea's death. The jury disagreed. On February 15, 1984, Janine Jones was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. In a subsequent trial, she was also convicted of injuring another child, Rolando Santos, by injection. She received an additional 60 years. The full scope of Janine Jones's actions may never be known. Investigators believe she may have been responsible for as many as 60 deaths during her time at Bexar County Hospital. Records from that period were shredded by the hospital, making additional prosecutions impossible. Due to a Texas law designed to reduce prison overcrowding, Janine Jones became eligible for mandatory release in 2018. Prosecutors scrambled to prevent this. In May 2017, a Bexar County grand jury indicted her on additional charges related to the 1981 death of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. In January 2020, she pleaded no contest to the charge and received an additional sentence, ensuring she would remain incarcerated. As of 2024, Janine Jones remains imprisoned in Texas. She is in her early 70s. She has never publicly admitted to harming any child. The families of her alleged victims continue to seek answers about what happened to their children more than 40 years ago. She was praised for her dedication to her patients. She was trusted because of her uniform and her presence at the bedside. The children who could have named her were too young to speak or too injured to survive. The harm that hides inside institutions often wears a caretaker's face. Beverly Allett. In 59 days, Ward 4 of the Grantham and Kesteven Hospital experienced more pediatric cardiac arrests than it had seen in the previous year combined. The common factor was not a virus or a contaminated medication. It was a newly hired nurse who seemed to appear whenever a child's condition suddenly deteriorated. Beverly Gale Allett was born on October 4, 1968, in Grantham, Lincolnshire, England. Her childhood was marked by frequent illnesses and injuries, many of which medical professionals would later characterize as suspicious. She sought attention through medical complaints. She wore bandages and casts that may not have been necessary. As an adult, she trained as a nurse, completing her studies at Grantham College in 1991. In February 1991, she was hired as an enrolled nurse on the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. The ward was understaffed, and her arrival was welcomed. Within days of beginning her position, children in her care began to experience unexplained medical emergencies. The first was 7-week-old Liam Taylor, who suffered a cardiac arrest on February 21st and passed away. His death was initially attributed to natural causes. Over the following weeks, 3 more children experienced near-fatal collapses. Then, on March 5th, 11-month-old Timothy Hardwick stopped breathing and passed away. On April 5th, 5-month-old Paul Crampton suffered multiple cardiac arrests before succumbing. On April 22nd, 15-month-old Claire Peck experienced 2 cardiac arrests. She did not survive. In total, between February and April 1991, 25 children on Ward 4 experienced serious medical emergencies. 4 passed away. 9 others suffered injuries, including brain damage from oxygen deprivation. When does coincidence become pattern and pattern become certainty? The investigation began in May 1991 when hospital administrators finally acknowledged that something was wrong. They contacted Lincolnshire Police. Detectives reviewed every incident, mapping the dates, times, and staff schedules. One name appeared on the duty roster for all 25 events: Beverly Allett. Forensic analysis revealed that several children had been injected with insulin, causing their blood sugar to crash. Others had been given potassium chloride, which stops the heart. Air had been injected into the bloodstream of at least one child. The methods varied, but the intent was consistent. Beverly Allett was arrested in November 1991. Her trial began at Nottingham Crown Court in February 1993. She was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. The prosecution presented forensic evidence linking Allett to the injections. Witnesses testified that she had been the last person with several children before they collapsed. Psychiatric experts testified that she likely suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which caregivers harm those in their charge to gain attention and sympathy. On May 17, 1993, Beverly Allett was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to to 13 concurrent terms of life imprisonment. The judge recommended that she never be released. The case prompted a government inquiry led by Sir Cecil Clothier. The resulting report, published in 1994, identified systemic failures in the hospital's oversight and made recommendations for improving safeguards in pediatric care. Many of these recommendations were implemented across the National Health Service. As of 2024, Beverly Allett remains incarcerated at Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, a high-security psychiatric facility. She is in her mid-50s. Applications for parole have not been successful. The families of her victims have consistently opposed any possibility of release. The children were brought to the hospital because their parents believed they would be safe there. They were placed in the care of professionals who were supposed to protect them. For 59 days, no one connected the emergencies to the woman who always seemed to be present when they occurred. The ward was understaffed. The assumption was trust. The cost was measured in lives that barely had a chance to begin. Lucy Letby. She was the neonatal nurse who sent sympathy cards to grieving parents. She was the colleague who comforted families in their darkest moments. And when investigators examined the deaths and collapses in the unit where she worked, they found handwritten notes in her home that appeared to confess to what she had done. Lucy Ann Letby was born on January 4, 1990, in Hereford, England. She grew up in a stable household, the only child of parents who worked for a building society and as an accountant. She was described as quiet, pleasant, and unremarkable. After completing her nursing degree at the University of Chester, she joined the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2012. The Countess of Chester Hospital is a district general facility serving the Cheshire area. Its neonatal unit cared for premature and critically ill infants. Between June 2015 and June 2016, the unit experienced a significant increase in unexplained deaths and serious collapses. Babies who had been stable suddenly deteriorated. Infants who were expected to recover did not. By early 2016, senior consultants had identified a pattern. They reported their concerns to hospital management. An internal review found that one nurse had been present for all of the incidents, Lucy Letby. The consultants requested that she be removed from the unit. Hospital executives initially resisted, citing a lack of definitive evidence. Letby was eventually reassigned to clerical duties in June 2016. Police began their investigation in May 2017. They reviewed medical records, staff schedules, and physical evidence. They interviewed dozens of witnesses. They searched Lucy Letby's home. What they found there would become central to the prosecution. Among Letby's possessions were handwritten notes on scraps of paper and post-it notes. Some contained phrases such as, "I am evil, I did this." Others appeared to express remorse, guilt, and a wish to be caught. The prosecution would argue that these were confessions. The defense would argue that they were the private writings of a distressed woman who had been unfairly accused. Can the words written in isolation reveal the truth that silence conceals? Lucy Letby was arrested for the first time in July 2018. She was arrested twice more as the investigation expanded. In November 2020, she was charged with murder and attempted murder. The trial began at Manchester Crown Court in October 2022. It would last more than 10 months, becoming one of the longest and most complex criminal trials in British history. The prosecution alleged that Letby had harmed infants through various methods, including injecting air into their bloodstreams, administering insulin, force-feeding milk, and physically assaulting them. They presented detailed medical evidence, expert testimony, and The damning, handwritten notes. They argued that Letby was motivated by a desire for attention and a fascination with death. The defense contested the medical evidence, arguing that the deaths could be attributed to natural causes, premature birth complications, or systemic failures at the hospital. They noted that the Countess of Chester's neonatal unit was understaffed and underfunded during the period in question. They characterized the handwritten notes as expressions of a nurse struggling with the trauma of working in a high-stress environment. On August 18, 2023, the jury delivered its verdict. Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 6 others. The judge, Mr. Justice Goss, sentenced her to a whole life order, meaning she will never be eligible for parole. She was the 4th woman in British history to receive such a sentence. A subsequent retrial on 1 count of attempted murder resulted in an additional conviction in July 2024. Lucy Letby was found guilty of attempting to take the life of a baby identified as Child K. In September 2023, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced a public inquiry into the case, chaired by Lady Justice Thirlwall. The inquiry will examine why it took so long for concerns to be acted upon, whether hospital management failed in its duty to protect patients, and what systemic changes are needed to prevent similar tragedies. As of 2024, Lucy Letby remains incarcerated at a maximum security prison in England. She has appealed her convictions, arguing that the verdicts were unsafe. The appeal process is ongoing. The families of her victims continue to seek answers about how a trusted caregiver was able to harm so many children over such a prolonged period. She sent sympathy cards to parents whose children had passed away under her care. She kept mementos of her time in the neonatal unit. The notes found in her bedroom were written by a woman who knew what she had done and who wrote it down where no one else was meant to see. The smallest patients in the hospital were placed in her hands because that is what hospitals are supposed to be for. The trust was absolute. The betrayal was written in her own words. 10 women, 10 faces the world chose to trust. The damage they caused was measured in lives, and the warning signs were only visible in hindsight. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.